By 2032, ACT will empower 20.2 million more learners to exit high school ready for post-secondary and work opportunities. We will concentrate our work around 5 strategic pillars: build, inform, connect, mobilize, and partner. We are collaborating with key stakeholders to bring this bold new vision to life. We've got our work cut out for us, and with your support moving forward, we will make it happen.
Hi friends, Angelica Vanetta, co-chair of Inclusive ICR. We are a coalition of over 220 employers in Eastern Iowa, all working together to grow the diversity and inclusion of our workforce, to create a space where employees feel a sense of belonging, included, and valued. Inclusive ICR is a proud sponsor of the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion track of the Iowa Ideas Conference. As you participate today, be sure to connect with other Inclusive ICR champions, as we'd love to share information with you about our upcoming coalition meetings, projects, and how our work is impacting positive social change in our region. Be sure to visit our website at inclusiveiowa.org for information on upcoming events and to sign up for our e-newsletter. Thank you and have a great conference.
Good morning. Welcome to session 1 of our Iowa Ideas Conference. I'm your moderator and K-12 education reporter for the Gazette, Grace King. This session is Tools for the Unique Needs of Students and is within the K-12 education track. I want to start by thanking our sponsors, TC Midwest, ACT, Cedar Rapids Bank and Trust, and Inclusive ICR Iowa. I want to remind you that all of our sessions are being recorded. If you have any questions or thoughts you'd like to share, please pop them into the chat and I will relay them to our panelists and to our audience. During this discussion, we will discuss what tools are available to educators to address the various needs of students as classroom culture evolves, how generations of educators are acknowledging and adjusting to changes in the classroom from when they were in school, and some effective strategies. Our panelists are Gina Weekly, who's the Director of Diversity, Equity, and Belonging for the Waterloo Community School District, Yen Yerhoven, CEO of Key Learning Background and author of her newly published book, Rebel Teaching, which I will let her tell you more about, Jenny Schultz, founder and CEO of Kids First Law Center in Cedar Rapids, and Dan DeVore, principal of the new City View Community High School in the Cedar Rapids Community School District. Welcome, panelists. Thank you so much for being here today. Why don't we start by talking about your roles in the K-12 school space? Gina, would you like to start, especially, as you're in this new role in the Waterloo School District this year?
Absolutely. Well, thank you all for allowing me the space to be here. As you stated, I serve as the first Director of Equity, Inclusion, and Belonging for Waterloo Community School District. And essentially, my role is to ensure that every student, every staff member, and essentially our community is set up in a way that every person can achieve and thrive as it relates to education. Because when we know our school systems thrive, then our community thrives. So taking a look at our policies, our procedures, having hard conversations, providing professional development, but also building committees that can help us do this work to make Waterloo Community School Districts a place where people want to be.
Thank you. Yen, tell me a little bit about Key Learning Background.
Yeah, sure. Well, when I started Key Learning, it was coming from a learning perspective. I'm actually a learning theorist and an education researcher. So we specialize in providing training and learning resources that really empower educators as well as students in both formal and informal spaces, with this idea that if we can help students learn anything, they can do everything that is in their future.
Dan, why don't you tell us about your role as principal of a brand new high school and a little bit about your background as an educator, what brought you to this point?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm principal at City View Community High School, which is our new magnet high school in Cedar Rapids. We're currently 910, just over 100 students. And our goal is to be community-based and contextualized learning. So students are learning through projects and through community partners and cross content ways with our staff. The Iowa Big is still alive and well, and I'm also principal and director of that also. So it's still serving college community and Cedar Rapids High School students, and co-located with us here in the Economic Alliance building, downtown Cedar Rapids. So up until this point, I was at Metro High School as a principal for about 5 years. And then before then, I was at Prairie High School as a teacher and principal as well.
How do you think your background, as the principal of Metro High School is helping you now with this different project-based learning that you guys are experimenting with and finding a pathway forward for?
I would say my roles in both places have situated me well for this position because of the diverse needs of learners in both systems. And I think really learning more about how to develop healthy relationships with students that can help drive them forward, and kind of like what Yen and Gina both talked about, getting to know them so they have that sense of belonging, and then also showing them the path forward and tying to their future and helping them believe they have a future.
Yeah, that's so important. Jenny, tell me about Kids First and how you work with school districts.
Yes, Kids First Law Center is a private nonprofit, and we provide services in the Cedar Rapids School District. So we have peace facilitators who are stationed in 10 Cedar Rapids schools. And really, we're focused on restorative practices and restorative justice. So our primary role is to resolve conflicts between students and then between students and teachers. But we also do some work with teachers to help them incorporate restorative practices in their classrooms.
Yeah, and I mean, that sounds exactly in line with what we want to talk about today, how educators are addressing the needs of the different needs of students in classes and schools. So Yen, you just published a book. Is it your first book? Can you tell me more about this?
Yeah, it is my first book, actually. It's called Rebel Teaching: How to Repurpose the American Education Machine. And the book is really about how we can, as a community, heal education by creating new ecosystems that involve family, communities, and business partners. So I actually wrote this book for anyone who is passionate about education, not just researchers, not just teachers, but for anyone, parents and families, to give them a blueprint for how they can create transformative change in education, no matter who they are or where they are.
That sounds incredible. And how are you kind of getting that out to school districts, to educators? Are you doing a book tour or anything like that?
Yeah, so actually, we are doing a book signing at the Erickson Public Library on November 28th. But, we just have a really strong community of educators and people who have supported the writing of this whole book for the past couple of years. And it's been really exciting to bring in the stories of folks who have actually done it, created these communities of belonging, reached, the diverse needs of the students in their districts. And so in a way, Rebel Teaching is about understanding that, yes, there are actually systems and plans and people who have been able to heal education where they are. And that by studying and learning about what they've done, we can just rinse and repeat and do it in our own communities as well.
Yeah, this sounds kind of like what Gina's doing. Can you talk about how a director of diversity, equity, and belonging was created for the Waterloo School District? Why was that a need that they saw needed to be met?
Yes, absolutely. So first and foremost, listening. I believe that our superintendent has done an amazing job of leading first with transparency, but also listening to the needs of our community. Listening to our parents, listening to our stakeholders, and knowing that we have needs that stand outside of the traditional academic setting, and knowing that it's all rooted in our equity practices or lack thereof. So being wise and knowing that, hey, we can't expect for someone in a leadership position already to take on components of this work. We need someone full-time to focus and prioritize this work so that we're able to be intentional and make sure that we're creating those spaces for our students and families, and as a result, our community to thrive.
Yeah, I'm glad that you added families because yeah, you can't meet students' needs without meeting the needs of families as well. I think that's really important. What is it like being the first person in this position in this district, creating what this looks like? What systems are you hoping to put in place?
Yeah, so it's exciting because the community is excited. The community has been overwhelmingly supportive. In addition to that, our staff are hungry. They're hungry for strategies, practices, and they're hungry to help, right? They want to know. So initially, this year, a lot of professional learning is happening, a lot of coaching, teaching our teachers and staff how to have hard conversations. Because I believe what has happened as a society is we've humanized a lot of this work as it relates to diversity, equity, inclusion. And I like to say to them sometimes we've looked at it as a bad word, right? When we talk about equity, and just kind of changing and shifting the narrative around it. And equity is simply giving every person what they need to thrive, right? Not assuming, but digging in and figuring out. So setting up strategies and systems to make sure that our teachers know what equity is, and that they're able to operate effectively in that role alongside our support staff and ultimately our leadership, but also working with the community to create spaces for our parents to learn alongside us, because we know if we teach it in the classroom, it does no good if it doesn't translate to the community and the spaces that our students go to when they leave our school buildings. So bridging that gap as well. Just a lot of work to do, but those are two things that I'm most excited about is professional learning and bridging that gap between community and school, which is extremely important.
Yeah, and panelists, feel free to jump in if you would like to continue talking about what Gina is saying. And audience, I just want to remind you that we are taking questions, so feel free to pop those in the chat.
One of the things I just thought of as Gina was talking was we worked with a consultant through the intercultural development inventory process that we were working on in Cedar Rapids, which really helped me as a person and as an educator. His name was Newa Abu Wahid. He often talked about the platinum rule. So the gold rule is treat others how you want to be treated. The platinum rule being treat others how they want to be treated. And that's always kind of one of those paradigm shifts that makes me think differently about how we handle those restorative conversations that we did with Jenny and her group.
Yeah, can you tell me more about, I think it's called IDI, what did you say it was called again?
Intercultural Developmental Inventory. It was a study, Gina, you're nodding your head too, you look like you're familiar with this. A study that was done based on, I believe it was like AmeriCorps or Peace Corps volunteers coming over abroad and learning about their experiences and how they were able to articulate what they went through in another country. And so learning about how we handle learning about other cultures and seeing other cultures and people. And so the idea is you do some learning on their continuum that they developed, and then develop your own plan on how you change how you're seeing and handling other cultures as they come into your life. So the continuum is focused on, starts in denial, then goes to polarization and minimization, acceptance and adaptation, with the idea that vast majority of educators are in minimization, where we know it exists, but we want to kind of tamp it down and use language like being colorblind and things like that without really fully understanding who's in front of us and how to best serve them.
And I'd pose to our other panelists, how have you seen that help educators respond differently to students?
Well, I would say when educators understand that a lot of the things that they interpret as misbehaviors are actually cultural ways of understanding and being, it creates stronger relationships and ties with students in the classroom, with each other, as well as students with their instructors. And, I think I'm going to skip ahead a little bit. I'm sorry.
Go for it.
One of the things that tends to get in the way, I think, especially in today's political climate, are a lot of misunderstandings that leave us very fearful of words like culture, diversity, equity, inclusion. And so a lot of teachers that we work with are afraid of even trying some of these techniques because they don't want the backlash from family or from school board or from others. And it's really important then to start with, looking at what are the misconceptions that we have, what are some of our assumptions that we have, but also understanding that our cultural frame of reference goes beyond our skin color. There are, family frames of reference. There are age frames of reference. There's religious frames of reference, right? Like that are culturally based. And once we kind of understand that we as individuals and our students as individuals belong to multiple cultural spheres, it makes a lot more sense when we see what happens when these spheres intersect. So I'm going to just stop there and let others pick up.
I think another term that's become kind of a dirty word is social and emotional learning. And I can't quite wrap my head around why that is something we wouldn't want for our kids. When you talk to employers in any workforce, these are the skills that they want their employees to have, right? Like to be able to build relationships, have self-awareness, be able to manage their emotions, collaborate, problem solve, right? So somewhere along the line, I think also, there's some fear around social emotional learning but I would also like to say that I think teachers today know so much more than we've ever known, right? So my dad is a retired teacher and my niece is in like her 5th year of teaching, and he says, early in her career she already knows more than I ever knew at the end of my career, because I do think teachers have learned a lot more about trauma and trauma-informed interventions, about social emotional learning, and about implicit bias and how that influences them in the classroom.
Why do you think that has changed from, when you guys were students, from when you started your career as educators? Why do you think those things, cultural responsive teaching, are becoming more important in the classroom?
Our society has evolved tremendously, right? We think about social media, we think about access to the internet, we think about societal pressures, and
the pandemic.
Yeah, the pandemic, right? Everybody had space and time to really dig into just things, and a blessing and a curse. Like, it has deeply rooted fear within a lot of our teachers. And I want to lean into what Jenny said, because I believe strongly in the quote that W.E.B. Du Bois stated when he said, children learn more from what you are than what you teach. And if we operate from that space of fear, we are then grooming, right, students that operate from that space. If we're operating from a space of just do as I say, right, which becomes practices in the classroom, then we then create those students who begin to operate in that way. So like when we think about culturally responsive teaching, I believe that is rooted in developing students' critical thinking abilities, developing those spaces where students get to discuss, right, get to dig into content, get to dig into current events that aren't teacher-led, but student-led, and dig in and tap into their geniuses and their cultures. And I'll pause there and let my colleagues discuss further.
And piggybacking on what Gina was saying as well, one thing that has really changed is the diversity in the United States. Oftentimes we meet with districts where suddenly their percentages of marginalized students has increased, and those students oftentimes have different ways of communicating understanding, making meaning than some of the traditional ways that we've taught in the past. And so one of the things that's important, in addition to society, like what Gina had said, is that with social media, students are used to having their voices out there in the virtual space. But who has taught them how to critically think about what they're saying? Who is teaching them how to process all of that information that is out there right now, determining what is, trustworthy versus what is, opinion and idea? We have to evolve as a society, but also in education, because we have to keep up with the technology that's out there, the different ways that students are learning these days, and the different ways even just our society in general is getting its information.
I think too that teachers have had to just by virtue of necessity change it up, and Dan can speak better to this than I can, but when we first started our project 6 or 7 years ago, I remember we had a teacher, where we were talking about, this student wants to do a circle with you. We think it might help the relationship that you have with the student. And the teacher said, well, I don't want to have a relationship with the student. I just want them to sit down and follow the rules. And I just think like that is going by the wayside, right? Like we don't really see that now. I think teachers, this generation and the teachers that we have are really seeing like it's about relationships, and when we form those with students, then it makes their job easier as a teacher.
This makes me think of, go ahead, Dan.
No, go ahead.
Well, this makes me think of the learning gaps between students of color and white students, especially in Iowa. How can cultural competency really help, elevate those students' opportunities?
So one of the things, kind of going back to your point, and something I was considering earlier as well, is one way that the work in the IDI and the IDC really helped us was to give us vocabulary to have conversations around these really scary topics. And they're scary for a variety of different reasons, right? Being afraid of saying the wrong thing and looking like a bigot, or saying the wrong thing and having the legislature mad at you, all these different things. And this gave us vocabulary that we could start to struggle with these concepts in a way that didn't feel as personal. So I think those tools are important to help teachers move forward. And the other thing, Jenny, with regards to relationships, it is interesting how the parent experience with education has evolved from back in the day when if I screwed up, it was on me and you got to figure this out. We're not getting you out of this. To now parents really working harder to help their students get out of situations. But even the parents that are more hands-off, if they feel like you don't care about their child, will become more hands-on. That is almost parents in my circles and parents I've worked with is the one key, that if they feel like you don't care about your child, now we have an issue. Kind of to Jenny's point about the teacher back not that long ago that said, I don't really care about a relationship. It's just not an option anymore.
Yeah, and piggybacking on that too, if we look historically at how the education system was created, during the progressive era, all of society suddenly started adopting what's called the Taylor system of scientific management. This idea where we're going to punish the ones that are not productive, we're going to reward the ones that are, and we're going to do it in the most cost-effective method possible. And the thing is, it lasted for a few years, and then around the 1980s is when businesses said, wait a second, this doesn't actually work anymore. We're seeing that this is not the way human beings process and learn and thrive. But the problem is education still hasn't caught up. We don't understand, at least in general, that managing at the least amount of cost possible doesn't work for students because they too are human beings. And learning in itself, just talking about what learning really is, in the past, we thought that learning was just about having students memorize facts and spew them back at us. The emotions, the social relationships, all of those things don't matter. But from a learning theorist perspective, learning is incredibly social. It's incredibly, about identity. It's incredibly emotional and physical. And when we excluded those factors in a learning environment, students don't learn. And, one of the things that I talk about, like when we actually speak to people, families especially, is think about the ways we personally learn. Like usually we don't learn meaningfully and effectively sitting at a desk, listening to somebody drone on and showing PowerPoints. We truly learn through interaction, through doing things, through, talking and, socially interacting. That's why those SEL skills are so important, because they're not a separate course. They have to be integrated into the learning that students are doing, because it's got to go beyond the cognition.
And that just makes me so excited, because that is exactly what we're trying to create with City View, right, Dan? Could you talk more about that?
My computer froze for a second when Yen was talking, so I'll do my best.
Yeah,
but I can't talk about.
I mean, how students learn differently, and really that approach to sitting in a classroom learning from a PowerPoint is not working.
Yeah, so I was really intrigued, Yen, about your book with the ecosystem learning, because we are in a cohort with Education Reimagined right now with schools across the country that are doing that very thing. So the idea of that the school is the hub, but it's not the totality of the learning, right? So learning in the community, experiencing the community, and learning from the community as key components. For us, it's really trying to follow that project-based design with some of the stuff that Education Reimagined and the learner-centered paradigm shift is done, with having students at the center of their learning, which is really hard, believe it or not, right? Not all students can articulate what it is they're interested in. And so really helping them to define that is a struggle, and can be a struggle, because it's a lot easier when TikTok just tells you what you're interested in versus really trying to make meaning of all the things coming at you. But that's ultimately our goal, is to help students see a variety of options for them in the community and what could be next and what their passions can be, and then harnessing those passions to really help themselves learn. So right now we're struggling a little bit with a student that just wants to code and be on the computer and all of that. So really developing that balance of helping them, like, yeah, let's go, let's do this. And also we got to get some of this other stuff done. So if we can do it through this model, great. If not, then work with us to make sure that we can tackle some of the algebra and some of the other stuff that maybe doesn't fit in his current passion. But as much as we can tie it to that, that's what we want to do, because we know that can really activate learning and cause us those rabbit holes we go down, right, are so much of the things that we're interested in that we're willing to spend the time.
We have an audience question here that I think goes really well with this conversation. She says, I love the idea of bridging the gap between school and community. How do you provide opportunities for teachers and administrators to learn from the community?
We have a position at, I'm sorry, Gina, go ahead.
Oh yeah.
We have a position at Iowa Big, which is a community development specialist. Megan Matson does that role. And so she liaisons constantly with businesses and brings in project ideas. And then we haven't totally activated that at City View yet, but for Iowa Big, they're meeting with those partners weekly and with students to talk about the progress on their projects that they're certifying standards through. For City View, we have a list of community partners that are willing to work with us, and then have a couple different staff members that are reaching out for site visits, for opportunities, for even like a field trip that's a little bit more immersed in the curriculum itself, as well as even locations. We have a class that meets every day at the library. They've been an incredible partner. So it's kind of the expectation on the teachers and our staff that we're just constantly reaching out and getting out. But again, our model is so different that it's hard to do at the traditional schools, but it's still possible.
Yeah, Gina, what were you going to say?
Yeah, so one way that is, it may be super simple, but leaning into your social media following. Most times your loudest voices and the people who have the greatest concerns will comment on social media. So leaning into some of those comments and developing relationships, asking the right questions on your social media platforms, and surveying your parents and community. But then a step further is developing listening sessions, which is one thing, not just listening sessions, but also learning forums. So taking those listening sessions and actually putting action behind them. So some of the gap areas that we're seeing within our community around attendance, right? What are some of the needs? What are some of the things that we can do here in our community but putting action around it and teaching our parents why attendance matters. In addition, academic achievement, like the IEP process, making sure that our parents are educated, right? That they know about policies and practices in school. That's how we start to bridge that gap, making them feel like they're a part of the school process because they are an intricate part of how successful our students are, but also how successful our schools are. And I think as school districts historically, we tried to operate on an island without the community, without parents, because we had the students. And what we're realizing is that the schools have to be community schools. So setting up those environments that feel safe, right? And immediately it might not be. So going to neutral spaces, letting them get to know school leadership, get to know school staff, and just constantly creating those spaces where you develop relationships. And I think Ian talked about this. Relationships are foundational to all things, right? And if a person doesn't feel safe, they don't feel heard, we're not meeting their needs, right? They're not going to move forward in progression with you. So I'll jump down off my soapbox and let some of my colleagues jump in.
I want to share, like, actually, this is exactly what the Rebel Teaching book is about. It's a blueprint on how you can actually reach out to your community partners. But I'm going to drop a few things in here for people who are looking for ideas. One is ASCD talks about wraparound schools. It's an actual plan where schools can actually do an audit of what the needs are of students. And when we look at the research as to why students are not academically successful, most of the time it has nothing to do with the school, believe it or not. It has a lot to do with the situations that students find themselves in. And so we have to bring in community partners because, you know, just like what Gina said, schools are often treated like they're islands. And here we are, the school is trying to meet all the needs of all their students. And oftentimes those needs are not entirely academic. For example, if you're hungry, can you actually learn in the classroom? You know, like if you're cold or if you have, you know, a family member that's unemployed, you know, a lot of these different factors, these emotional factors that students bring in, if they're not addressed, you know, and it's like us, right? It's really hard to learn in those environmental spaces. Gina also talked about the relationships and the belonging. Sometimes if kids are not feeling like they belong, that's going to be a big impact as to whether or not they're going to actually be able to learn in those spaces. So, you know, I would say that community schools are absolutely critical if we want to close those gaps, if we want to change, you know, how students are learning in any space, to be honest with you. And I've run out of words, so I'm going to step down now.
It reminds me of saying that it's not that kids do well when they want to, it's that kids do well when they can. And
yes,
you know,
yes.
that when they've got trauma and need to, you know, have that like some emotional kind of or mental health needs met, or just that relationship and connection. I think that's key. And I also I 100% agree that I think community partners can really make a difference. Having nonprofits come into schools and bring their expertise in certain areas. We've seen that a lot, you know, in the Cedar Rapids School District. I'm sure many others, right? Like Tanager bringing in therapists to do mental health for students who need it, or you know, others that are doing important work with kids in the school setting, but a great partnership.
I think that's huge. The community partner piece. I'm really happy you brought that up, Jen, because I had an opportunity because of a tragic shooting that involved some of our students while I was at Metro, to go with some community leaders to New York and learn about the group violence intervention that was founded out of John Jay and how we could activate that in Cedar Rapids. And while I was there, one of the presenters, Thomas App, who wrote the book Bleeding Out, I had a chance to have a conversation with him kind of offline, and he asked me about, you know, why are you here? And I told him, and he said, that's amazing. And also, your community most needs you to teach. Don't forget that, right? And so sometimes in education we do, because we're worried about all these other things that you all just mentioned, and they're super important. But learning about the human in front of you and who they are as a human, and then helping as we can as schools to connect them with other people that can do the other things, right? I can't be the therapist. I can listen to you and I can hear you out, but you're going to need somebody that's much better and more professional at that than I am to take that the next step. And giving ourselves permission to have those boundaries and understand where we get off and we bring in community partners to support that work is super important.
I think
I want to put a plug in for another panel I'm moderating tomorrow at 9:40. It is about social needs and partnerships between schools and nonprofits. So this is such a perfect conversation, and we get to talk more about that tomorrow. Very cool. And one of our panelists is from Tanager Place. So if anyone wants to tune into that, I invite you to do so. Sorry to interrupt you, Gina.
No, you're good. So one of the things I absolutely want to emphasize is, although we are going to make sure that we have what our students need, we would be absolutely remiss if we do not tap into our greatest resource, which lie in front of us in our students, our parents, the families, the support system that those students have. Because we in education oftentimes operate from a space of assumption, right? And we know what assumptions do for us, right? It makes us but making sure that we're connecting with parents. There have been so many times that I walk into classrooms, coaching around behaviors, and the first question I ask is, have you reached out to the parent? It's almost always no. And I'm like,
Yeah.
Again, we go back to fear, right? Level of cultural competency. I don't know how to have dialogue. I'm afraid to have those conversations. And if we misstep there, we are missing out on one of our greatest resources. But also it makes our parents and families feel like they are not a valued contributor in their students' and child's education, which goes back to that gap, right?
Yeah.
So it's all good and well to develop all these programs and systems, but we misstep when we don't include our families as a part of that process as well, and get their vantage point of what would work best for the family unit. Because again, we have to serve that child holistically, right? We can't just serve them academically, but holistically, because once they leave our classroom, we don't know what environments they go to. It just makes me think about myself as a student. I grew up in Waterloo schools. My ACEs score, adverse childhood experiences, is a 9 out of a 10. And I believe that back then, my teachers were freaking amazing at figuring out what my needs were, but also tapping into my family, right?
Yeah.
My big sister, my little brother, my mom, figuring out exactly what I needed. And sometimes before I even knew I needed it, they had it there readily available to me. My father passed away. I came back to school. They had a grief group set up, right? It was serving me holistically, and things that I'll never forget. And as a result, I became a greater human being and adult. Again, children learn more from what you are than what you teach.
Thank you so much
that-
for sharing your story, Gina.
Yeah,
Go ahead, Dan.
That's a couple times that you brought up talking to families, and I think that's super important. You brought up IEP meetings earlier, and so often I've been in IEP meetings where we're just lecturing the parent. And so, yeah, it's about knowing the laws, but also making sure that we're facilitating those conversations to hear their voice and surface their voice, which is one thing that Jenny, your group, does very, very well. And it's how I've learned from as well. But that's such a key part. It's not just calling home to say this is what's wrong with your kid. It's calling home to say, help me help you, or help me help your student, right? What do they need? What best activates their learning and their passions? Those types of conversations is critical.
Yeah, and also I would say, that talking to students first, because there are some who, we've learned that it can be really dangerous for them actually to involve the family. So if they're like, if we've had kids who've been involved in misbehavior, and it's like, well, this call home is going to result in, a physical beating, right? Like, then we have to be attentive to that too, but that goes back to relationship, right? So if we know that student well enough and know who are their supports and their they're trusted adults. But otherwise, I agree that involving the family is really helpful to understanding the whole picture.
That
That's a great point too. Like the trusted adults and what we have in Infinite Campus and the bureaucracy of who we can contact legally versus who's their tribe, who's their people, what's the ecosystem, and that can be a delicate balance as well. That dovetails well. Sorry to interrupt again.
No, not at all. I was going to say, but this goes right back to what we were talking about in the beginning, which is culturally responsive teaching. Like oftentimes we think culturally responsive teaching and the public is like, oh no, it's CRT and all of this stuff. But in reality, culturally responsive, culturally sustaining, both of those terms, it's about understanding the cultures that we come from and the cultures our students come from. It's not about saying one is better than the other. It's not about shaming. It's nothing like that. It's about understanding, for example, how does a family discipline? How does a family teach? How do they communicate, right? Like one of the basic things that we do to introduce teachers who might be a little bit gun shy in a way, I shouldn't use the word gun shy, but, shy about delving into culturally responsive teaching is to explain, for instance, the simple idea of communication. There's like informal communicators, and then there's jump-in talkers, and there's direct communicators, right? Knowing, what kind of communicator you are tends to come from a family culture. And understanding then for a student how we come from all these different cultures and how, even teachers understanding that how we come from different cultures builds cultural dexterity. Meaning if I'm in a situation where I know I'm an indirect talker and I'm in a board meeting where everybody's a direct talker, I know the skills through cultural responsiveness, through SEL, of how to adapt myself to effectively communicate in that situation and vice versa. If I'm a direct talker, I know if I'm really blunt in a space where, I'm with folks that are indirect talkers, it may come off the wrong way. So knowing how to read the room is a huge skill, right? But it comes from that cultural responsiveness that students need to be taught when they're in the classroom.
I think that leads really well. We have another audience question. They say, what are your thoughts on changing core curriculum to address emotional and critical thinking skills that seem to be lacking in family learning?
I would like to start.
Go ahead, Jenny.
I feel like it's, that social emotional learning is built into how the content is taught. So like, for example, with restorative practices, if the teacher is rolling out a new science lesson on frogs, like if they're sitting in a circle with the classroom and they're like, what are things about frogs, and then they're going around and what are the things you're curious about frogs, right? Like, and so there's a way in which inviting kids to be curious and inviting them to kind of think for themselves, and inviting them in a way where it's a conversation and their views are important too. I think models the social emotional learning piece, right? So it can just be built into any lesson. It's not just like its own separate thing, right?
Yeah, and piggybacking on what Jenny was saying too, is it's not so much what is being taught as opposed to how it's being taught. So like, with Dan's School of Problem-Based Learning, you can have the same standards and the same core, but how it's being taught is very different because it honors the social, emotional, physical, all of those other aspects that come into, how we learn. And I mean, one example that I like to give is driving, right? Like, yes, you can ace the driver's test, but as my teenage son knows, you still can't survive on the highway if you just come from the manual. And so if we teach from a standpoint of getting the kids to be behind the wheel and driving instead of the teacher being behind the wheel, that's how they acquire those skills. It's not, like I said, the content's the same, right? Like the content's the same if you're pulling out a driver's manual or if you're sitting behind the wheel, but the way you're learning it and the way it's being taught to you, completely different.
think that's when it becomes important to really tap into our innovative new teachers, right? Who have seen parts of this world that some of our veteran teachers haven't, and asking them, how would you teach, you know, these core concepts non-traditional, right?
Mhm.
Giving them that opportunity, but also tapping into our students, right? Like,
Oh, yeah.
if these were the concepts that needed to be grasped, what would be the easiest way to get you to grasp them? So leaning into our true experts of this world, which are our youth and our new teachers, because they've had more access to internet, to media, right, to tools. They're the true experts of this world, and we want to hang on to power, though. And so we stay in old systems and continue old practices, and we continue to get the same results.
Yeah. And
And a lot of fearless too, like allowing students to drive is scary, right? Like your teenage child. My son's a driver, but we haven't done the highway yet. Terrifies me. But similarly,
terrifying, yes.
I don't know how this turns out. But like you said, Jen, with that project base, it's the kids are leading. I know the standards, but I'm not leading this. I'm going to help. I'm going to support you. There are some lessons I'm going to teach because I know you need that explicit instruction on this concept in order to be able to unlock more of what you need to do. But you're going to drive this.
Yeah, and just from what Gina was saying too, another resource that maybe the audience might want to tap into is a book called Distributed Leadership by Dr. Sean Nelms. And in Distributed Leadership, he actually explains how you put students in charge in many ways of what the school rules are, how to manage behaviors, how to understand what school culture is and what they want it to be. An incredible book with a couple of case studies of where schools have been turned around because students now have not only an investment in the leadership of the school and in how that school runs, but also they know that their voices are being heard. And it's like with any human being, if you're in a space where we talk about like this deficit model of education, which is historically what's happened, the deficit model, meaning we view our students, we view everybody in the school system as lacking something, as missing something, as having a weakness, as empty minds where content has to be poured into them. If we flip that into this asset-based mindset of what are everybody's strengths, how do I leverage strengths, or what I call the genius, the collective genius in the classroom, in the school, in the structure, you've got now this thought of I matter, I'm being listened to, I contribute, and I help. And that's really the strong flip that is going to really help in education, I think.
I also, to jump onto what you were talking about, Jan, with the driving metaphor, but also students being able to take projects and what you said, Dan. I think kids learn it by doing. So like in the conflict resolution world, when we are doing circles with kids and they're resolving a conflict between them and another student, they're the ones that are coming up with like, what will it take to make things right? So the question is on them to propose the solution. And then it's really remarkable, like the things that they come up with are often more creative, and maybe even more tailored to that harm than what the tools that we thought of as adults, because we're like, oh, we can do these 3 things, and they've got more ideas. But then also once they learn that skill of doing conflict circles, then you see them doing it themselves, right? So they'll just naturally start resolving conflicts on their own or with other kids, and there's are great models around peer mediation and things like that. So I do think it's all the things that all of you have just been saying about giving them the skills and then letting them run with it.
Well, I want to take the last few minutes here to talk about current legislation. How is it impacting what you guys are doing? And especially as we talk about, evolving classroom culture and finding effective teaching strategies for, 2020s that we're living in.
I feel like I need to reach out to my my attorney to see if I can answer this question. One of the big struggles we're facing right now, Grace, my understanding is the Department of Education still hasn't come out with the best practice or the model language for some of the policies. And typically that comes out shortly after the legislation, but we're still behind on that. So there's a lot of things that we don't know yet, and are just treading lightly in some areas.
I think exactly to what Dan said. I think the legislation, it's particularly Senate File 496 that put a lot of new rules and restrictions in place for K-12 education, really has educators scared, right? Like Dan's comment, I need to ask the lawyers, right? Because there are really serious consequences that were put in place and sections of it around losing licenses and that kind of thing. And I think it's an unintended consequence of this legislation is that it's really stifling and interfering with teachers' ability to form connections and relationships to students. So, when you restrict the teacher's ability to call the child a nickname, right? That's just the name, their preferred name, even separate and apart from anything to do with gender identity, but just their preferred name. Or when we restrict the ability of teachers to ask questions about child's mental health or emotional well-being or things going on in their family or suicidality, even just like we had a threat in the Cedar Rapids School District that disrupted things last week. And when students came back on Tuesday after not having school on Monday, we had teachers who said, I'm afraid to ask kids how they're feeling about it because I think I'm not supposed to survey them on social emotional things. So I don't know that I can even ask like how they're feeling about this. So just like, then I think it's probably like a stronger reaction to the legislation than there needs to be, but it's just like, it's a fear-based thing, which is understandable given how onerous or how heavy the legislation is.
Well, and in an age of a teacher shortage, to have folks in education say things like, but if they're going to take my license for that, maybe I don't belong here anyway. That's not where we need to be right now.
Exactly. Well, I have to say we're already in trouble because I wrote a book called Rebel Teaching for a reason. So I'm going to just drop that word there for whatever way people want to interpret it. But I also want to say that a couple of years back, I had the pleasure of sitting in on a fireside chat with our Secretary of Education. And, a teacher asked a similar question even back then of like, what do we do about legislators, about people who are deciding on important education policy and topics who don't have the education background or understanding to do so. And what he said is we have to, as educators, take charge of the narrative. And what he meant by that is there are so many misconceptions and assumptions that people have about the teaching profession, about what's happening in schools and about education. And oftentimes, historically, we let that happen. We let others speak for us in education instead of speaking out about it. We silence our students instead of encouraging them to share their stories of success, to share the best ways they learn, to brag about the wonderful things that are happening in their classroom. And so what I would say is, in light of education policy, education is how we beat this. We have to educate. We have to let people understand this is how students learn. This is what students need to do that is best for them. We have to give our students the voice and the wherewithal to share that message as well. So that's what I'm going to say about that.
And I've heard something recently. I'm in a doctoral program at Baylor, and one of my professors said something that stuck with me. She said that knowledge is power. Knowledge is both power for us, but knowledge is power on us as well. So just as you just said, that vehicle from oppression is education. right? Although they put limitations on us as educators, that doesn't stop us from teaching. That doesn't stop us from having critical and effective dialogue, allowing spaces for our students to be heard, to be seen, to be valued. Yes, they may have taken away the ability to use those nicknames, but if those students can come in and say, what are 3 important things that I should know about you that I might not already know? Guess what? Although you're not able to share that nickname, you feel a sense of connection in that classroom, and you're still going to be able to thrive. I think sometimes as educators, we focus so much on and give so much power and so much energy to legislation that we forget that we have so much power in us as humans, as change agents, to still create spaces that are safe, that are conducive for learning. Outside of all of those rules, you can still create spaces where students feel safe, protected, and as if they belong. But starting with educating them, having real and raw conversations about legislation, right? It doesn't say we can't teach our students what the law says. So then we're preparing them for how to have conversations with their classmates, with their parents. How is this affecting you at home? That's being a change agent. And if we care so deeply, let's make sure that we're voting as educators, that we're lobbying as educators, right? That we're running for office. Who knows best how these education systems work than educators? Let's run for office. Let's take back our communities, and let's not allow them to silence our voice. There's so much power, but oftentimes we give it up because we feel so oppressed. Well, guess what? We've had marginalized demographics historically, all of this earth's existence. We're still here, right? Marginalized people are still here and still fighting. Let's get in this fight together, is what it is. Now it's impacting the greater society. Now it's time to tap into our marginalized group and ask, how did we do it back then, right? And it's by banding together and sticking together and using our voices and our power and our influence to let them see how hurtful and harmful this is, and it's taking our voice back. Sorry,
Gina,
I get really passionate about that.
No,
But
I love
we
it.
have
And Gina,
power.
the other day, when we were talking, you also, and what you said again about, talking to kids about what the legislation is, I think it's brilliant, right? Because sometimes it's like saying like, well, here's the rules we have to operate under. And Gina, you pointed out like, well, okay, so a teacher can't initiate that conversation, but a student can. And so just finding the ways, that students see in this, and just, getting creative in that way, I think is also really empowering for them.
And
That
nothing, oh, go
that
ahead.
takes educators really understanding the law themselves. How do you guys think that the educators can, help themselves know that they understand it?
Can I just say, I think we ask so much of teachers
Yeah.
and
Yes.
principals and everyone. And so it's like, well, in addition to being experts in all
Yeah.
of these areas and learning, all these new, theories and everything, like now we want you to read legislation and understand it and digest it. And I just think it's a lot to ask of them. But I do think asking, good specific questions of, schools council can be helpful. Like, does this mean I'm not allowed to have a safe space poster in my classroom? Does this mean I can't ask students how they're feeling today? Does this mean, I think when attorneys for schools get those specific questions, I think they could say like, no, it doesn't mean that, right? Like that you can still do these things. And so getting clarity is important.
And it's developing the tools to equip our teachers, right? So in our district, and we developed a slide deck at the start of the school year. This is what we know. This is the legal advice that we got. It created like, this sense of calming. And we created a document where it's running, where they can ask questions. And we have our legal team answering those questions. Make it accessible to your teachers. Transparency is key in this. And sometimes we lack humility as leaders to say, I don't really know. Let me get help. Instead, we ignore. Sorry, go again.
No, I was going to say also it's important to also inform your families. This is where you can get your families involved. This is where you can say, you know what, this is exactly what just happened. And there is nothing more powerful than having parents and students in front of a school board. Let me tell you, nobody says no to kids. And when they come in and they say what's going on and they share their stories of what the legislator is doing to them or what's happening, or even if you're even afraid of that, sharing the stories of success of what their learning is like, the success stories need to be out there. Just having that in front of a school board is a powerful thing that's going to outweigh the fear.
Well, thank you all so much. I'm afraid that we have run out of time, but I have loved learning from you. I know our audience has too. Thank you all for attending this session on the tools for unique needs of students. Our next session in the K-12 education track is opportunities and challenges for students of color. Thank you all for being here. I hope you enjoy the conference.
Thank you, everyone.
Yeah.
Thanks all.